A very good morning to you all.
Good morning, everybody.
Nice to see such a big turnout, and to kind of hijack the topic first, a big thank you to all the volunteers and organizations, members of Doors Club. Please give them a very warm applause, because these guys and girls are amazingly awesome. And this is also a test if you're actually listening to me. So if you start applauding now, then you've listened.
Yeah,
thank you!
Well done, thank you. Thank you, organization, volunteers. You've done a great job so far. We've really enjoyed it here.
It's always a pleasure to come back here. So first, some shameless self-introduction. Meet
Hi,
Robin.
this is me. I don't know, some of you may have seen the talk yesterday, some of them not. I fly airplanes. These airplanes are not particularly high-tech, but it's a lot of fun. I like things like stable software. I've been working with stable software and less stable software for quite a long time now. I do some IT consultancy, and I like working together with Hans de Raad. We work on projects together and on talks like this.
So, focus on me. If all of you can recognize me in the picture, maybe not, but that is me handling my own grapes. I love to do stuff outside of the IT realm as well, which includes organizing classical concerts, driving classical cars, and making my own wine. But apart from that, I'm also involved in IT-related topics, which means breaking stuff. As an ethical hacker, I get paid to disrupt the services of companies and governmental agencies, which actually is a fun thing to do, I think. And, well, today we are here with you to actually follow up a bit on the topics that Hannah just touched in his very excellent presentation. This is not a technical talk. This is a talk about context. This is a talk about history. This is a talk about history repeating itself, especially when monetary equations come into the picture.
It's about the societies we are in, and it's about our place as free software entrepreneurs in that society.
And as introduced, we went back into time a little bit, and as today we have a situation where we seem to be cycling back into history a little bit by pretty much looking at ourselves, trying to make the world a little bit smaller and to make it a little bit more easily to comprehend for us. Yet there are also movements and developments in the other direction. And one of the first actual actions on that part, when a state-driven company decided that, hey, you know, we've just entered this Portuguese vessel in our soon-to-be colony Indonesia, and hey, what do you know, the Portuguese didn't like that. They somehow didn't find it very sympathetic that we took their loot and we stole their property, and, well, yeah, well, what do you know, we need to legitimize this. So we had this very bright person, Hugo de Groot, who is actually also famous for being smuggled out of a prison inside a bookcase. We asked him, or at least the Dutch government in the 17th century, asked him to come up with a legitimization of us entering a Portuguese ship and stealing their stuff, which we did. And what happened then is this legislation was followed up by several other governments, most notably the English.
Yeah, because oddly enough, it wasn't just the Dutch who said, this is a good idea, let's have non-state actors embrace violence on open seas. The English came up with it in 1658, when they also said, well, not only are we going to allow ships to give them a letter mark, which is basically a letter saying, yeah, you can invade other ships, but also have good rulings about how much money that you should give to the state. So, you know, there's national flavors to these forms of piracy.
Yeah, and the first state-organized navy was actually to protect the wine trade between the UK and France. So I'm very much enthusiastic about the whole practical approach governments are taking into position.
Yeah, because navies are expensive, and handing out a letter of marque is very cheap, especially if you can get money coming in from that.
So, but then you come into this area where legislation starts to cause friction, because for some reason, as a state, if you create laws, then those laws in some way also apply to yourself, and they remove a certain level of flexibility. So, if you look at monetary disputes, for ages we've had the so-called gold standard, which meant that your banknote in your wallet represented an exact amount of gold or silver or whichever expensive metal was hip and happening at that time. So you could go to a bank, a national bank, and actually receive that amount of metal in return. But that started to cause friction, because somewhere, well, first during the 30s depression, Roosevelt already started nibbling on that particular standard. And then you got the Vietnam War, and Nixon basically decided, well, you know, until now we had this very clear and explainable concept. Let's forget about that.
Yeah, let's tie it to the US dollar instead of having the English with their pound tie it to gold. And yeah, at one point they said, well, we want to have a reserve currency because that gives us more freedom to print out more money, and we can circulate how we want within the US system.
And that's actually a very clear representation of the network efforts in place. Because by that time, the world was so much bought into the American dollar and Pax Americana that, well, basically, what could anyone do? Well, not that much, because the alternative was basically turn over to communism, which wasn't necessarily the most sustainable alternative. But the thing is that we nowadays are pretty much looking at the same type of thing, but then not necessarily being it an investment in the dollar, but being it an investment of our personal information and our personal history into these huge networks that, well, you have to ask yourself, what is, in this case, the product? Am I using the product, or am I supplying the company with the product?
Yeah, and you see the way that companies are doing this at the moment is actually the product they say they're delivering are channels. And the more people that can interact with these channels, the better their hookup is and the more data they have. And that's how they actually generate the data, which they make their money off.
And the interesting is that until quite recently, we actually had laws which, especially in the US in this case, prohibited one company from gaining so much power that they would be able to combine both a channel as well as the communication on it. In the 90s, several telcos and ISPs were split up based on legislation, and somehow that's not happening.
And before that, we had other networks, channels, called, for example, the railroads, where basically, well, you can't just have one company running all this. It's monopolistic and it's dangerous. And just exactly the telcos earlier in America, I think it was the 50s or the 60s, where Bell Corporation was split up because, it's just too powerful.
And we now see a new attempt at such a thing. We have in the EU this rising awareness that we might want to take more control over our own informational future as well as our own informational past. Because in the Netherlands, and this is a very current an actual item, there is discussion going on in the Dutch cabinet right now if the internet and ISPs and data centers should be labeled as critical national infrastructure in the same way that we label our drinking water supplies to be critical national infrastructure.
Yeah, which is interesting because, you know, we're going for globalist networks in terms of countries, in terms of Facebook kind of companies, but we're also seeing a resurgence in little nationalistic or tribal interest groups. The EU says we do it slightly differently than we do in America, and in the Netherlands they're saying, yeah, but we still think about it slightly differently than in France, for example.
Yeah, and what's also interesting is that this morning Facebook came with a statement that they would basically cut their platform in half. So you would have a X amount of users which were being shoved under the EU legislation, well, partly because it is actually unavoidable not to be under EU legislation if you are here. But now we have a Facebook which is legally vested in Ireland, in the EU, and you have a Facebook that will be legally vested in the US for the rest of the world. Yeah. Which is interesting because if you look at it from a network perspective, how will these two communities or channels be able to interoperate, interact with each other, exchange information? This is a very diffuse situation. The risk, of course, is that if these channels become so omnipresent, then a naive CEO, if we want to label it in a positive way, can basically cause you and your loved ones to, well...
But not only that, not only Mr. Cambridge Analytica, I don't know if you guys had the scandal as big here, but it's also suddenly becomes a hugely interesting target for hackers and other people, nation states who want to know more about their populace. And if you say, well, you know, Facebook, there are alternatives. So, for example, in China, you have Weibo. Yeah, is anyone here going to go onto Weibo, the Chinese social networking platform? I don't think our Chinese is good enough. So they do have us in a lock-in.
And that, again, is the network effect. The vested interest that both a company has in keeping a platform as internally focused as possible, as well as the interest that you yourself have into participating into the internal focus of that platform, basically contradicts the whole idea of open innovation and open communication. And if you look at the behavior of such big companies, especially when it comes to innovation, it becomes easier to simply buy out a number of startups than to actually innovate yourself. And for startups, it becomes rather a target to be bought by a large company than to innovate yourself.
Yeah, but Hans, I'm not sure I agree with this. I think that if you have a big company with a huge R&D development area, you can do some serious research. You can buy some facilities and you can buy some hardware that like these tiny startups can never do. I think there's something to be said for having like huge companies with all the research in it.
I'm not against that. I'm just saying that it's interesting to see that when you look at the product expandment of, let's say, Google, for instance, and YouTube, it's basically a Lego box of added services by buying a startup. And that goes back to Mare Liberum, actually. You were probably wondering where the hell are they going with this? Well, back to Mare Liberum, back to piracy. Because the whole idea about Mare Liberum and the East India Trade Company was that it became so big as a company, it was actually the first company worldwide that resulted into opening a stock market to be able to handle, to trade in the stocks of the East India Trade Company. And they actually had a sustainable 120-year record of year-by-year exponential growth. And well, then basically what happened was that their business case got lost somehow.
Yeah, it did get lost somehow, but you know, the stockholders must have gotten incredibly rich while it was running.
Yeah, and by the time it wasn't running anymore, most of them died already. So.
Yeah, but I mean, have you ever heard of trickle-down economics? I mean, you know, that must have been incredibly good for the economy.
Really?
Yeah, all these rich people with all this money.
Yeah,
do you guys know trickle-down economics? Ever heard of it? No? Yeah. Isn't it a great business model for, like, everyone else?
Really?
No, I don't think so.
Really interesting. All right, so let's zoom out a little bit. Let's look at the big picture here. And that's, from a rhetorical point of view, always a nice thing to distract from the fact that you've actually stuck into a certain route. But now we will diverge. on our original topic. We will focus on Northern/Western Europe. For the sake of argument, we will also include Croatia into that picture because, well, we're here anyway. But thank you for being here as well, and we love you too. But demographics...
It was on the picture of the map you... Croatia was on the picture of the map.
Yeah, it's absolutely. It's right there. Yeah. It's very relevant. So, demographical. What's happening? Basically, what we are seeing is that as our demographics show an aging picture of our citizenry, we need different types of services. We need better communication channels. We need easier to use telemedicine appliances because we simply don't have the workforce, or let's rephrase that, we don't want to spend the money on creating the workforce necessary to do it all by hand.
Just like import them from, I don't know, Africa or something.
Yeah, somehow the political climate is changing a little bit towards that because we tend to revisit history again into this whole concept of localism. And this is, well, the positive idea is buy local and support your local economy. But that topic is also hijacked by a number of, let's say, more or less populist politicians.
Yeah, here in Holland, you have Geert Wilders. I know these guys in Hungary, they're kind of into building walls or something.
Yeah, or barbed wire fences.
Since when have walls ever worked?
Popular hobby.
But you guys probably also have some super nationalistic guy here in Croatia who just wants to keep out the migrants. But I think there's a problem there because your lower classes are being elevated also here. Every year we come back, we see that actually Zagreb becomes nicer and nicer, the buildings become cleaner, the cars on the street become nicer, people are driving more Mercedes. Yeah, so...
Yeah, absolutely true. And the thing is that the whole nationalistic and let's say inward-facing approach entirely contradicts with any evidence-based successful business strategy that has been applied over the past, let's say, 500 years. If you look at companies like Siemens and IBM, if you look at what these companies were 50 years ago versus what they are now, they have absolutely nothing to do anymore with their original business case. They've adopted with the time. So maybe that's the same. And the open source attitude and the sharing attitude as well, I think we've made a point about that last year in our talk then. We need more exchange. We need more participation.
And if you're talking about Mare Liberum and this giant sort of network of networks we're in, don't think we're not talking about software development also. You know, you guys are dependent on other people within that floating sea for your products to work. Without PHP, a lot of websites would not work. I think most people now use Node.js in a lot of web development work. So there is huge amounts of interdependencies.
Yeah, and if you look at the new business models by most companies who have anything to do with shiny new concepts like AI and machine learning, open source basically is the plumbing of that entire industry. Without open source and free software, there would be almost no innovation at all in that particular area.
Yeah, TensorFlow, for example, they've open sourced it. Why? Well, to get you to use it, to lock you into Google. It's a semi-open approach.
But there's also an interesting thing when you look at globalization from a production point of view. 3D printing, for instance, started out as a, let's say, very cute and local thing of being able to print telephone sheets and stuff. But now, at least in the Netherlands, we see shared 3D production facilities where you, as a startup, can buy capacity of that production facility and actually have even parts of houses being 3D printed prefab. And that's a big departure from the original model in which company investment was not only targeting intellectual property, but production capacity as well. But since production capacity is actually coming back in our living environment, the whole idea of protecting intellectual property and the necessity for protecting intellectual property shifts, because the design for those houses, the design for those prefab houses and other types of infrastructure, they're all open source.
Yeah, it starts becoming more and more of a serious impediment to innovation and growth. I mean, when the Disney laws went through, or the Sonny Bono laws, it wasn't such a problem. There was people innovating in left or right, and they didn't need each other's innovation so much. But now we have to stand on the shoulders of what went before.
Yeah. If you look at copyright laws in America, for instance, about 110 years ago, there was virtually none. Everything was copied from externally. But under pressure of the entertainment industry, like Disney, America now has the most stringent copyright firms. But that brings us into politics as well. And politics are pretty much about how can we explain and represent the reality of today so that it fits my current populist target. And what we see is, and this is pretty much a global development, we see more and more fencing going on. We see continental blocks emerging, northern USA, China, Russia, the Middle East, and whatnot. And actually Europe is in the middle of that.
And there are blocks within blocks. So within Europe, you're saying you have the Baltic states, and you have
the Visegrad
West
states,
Europe, and
the Eurozone, and whatnot. And how does that work? It's basically a repetition of history again. Because in history, you see widening perspectives, narrowing perspectives, widening perspectives, narrowing perspectives. And the first response, whenever anyone feels left out, when the broadening perspective turns out to be, let's say, stealing jobs or moving away capital, the first response is to lock down again. But how does that work with the current global communication platforms that we have, right? The internet. Is there such a thing as a continental internet? Is there such a thing as Berlin?
Well, quite interestingly, you do see that President Macron had a long interview in Wired about artificial intelligence. He wants to move artificial intelligence into Paris and make France the center of AI, machine learning for Europe. And he says the reason he wants to do that is because he thinks that the discussion we have in the application and the culpability of machine learning AI type systems is different from the one they have in America. And he thinks this is the future, it's going to be at some point. And he thinks it's very important that ethically, at least France's values are represented in this discussion. And the only way he can do that is just by funding it massively. So he's putting 1.5 billion euros in the coming 5 years into AI development. So it's also an ethical consideration.
Yeah, and the ethical consideration primarily is that whatever we are doing today with technology, how does that enable us to, let's say, in 10 years, come to the realization that we may have went into a path that we need some more regulation on and still be able to perform that. But if you look at the way that in some parts of the world we're moving with the environment, for instance, with the human-caused global warming, that is an example of how technology and the Industrial Revolution went into an absurd scale, even affecting our surroundings. And actually, when you look at the Dutch government labeling drinking water and the internet as both being vital infrastructure, the comparison isn't even that far-fetched.
Yeah, and amazingly enough, 200 years ago, we were all farmers.
Yeah, if you look at economy, for instance, 200 years ago, indeed, over 60% of the professional population had something to do with food production. Yet, when industrialization came across and some other developments, occurred, somehow we departed from that model, and now we are actually discussing if we need to implement something like a basic income, because we've automated so much and we've industrialized so much that we simply have too many people for the work to do anyway. So, back to legislation, and why is legislation implemented? Why are laws being created? Well, basically, it means we either want to control a development or we want to limit certain developments from happening in such a way that we cannot control it over time. Yet, if you look at the targets of laws regarding the personal space and the corporate space, there is a very interesting difference, because up until now, laws that were targeting the personal space either had something to do with, well, healthcare or criminal law, like thou shalt not kill thy neighbor, for we don't like you killing your neighbor. While in the corporate domain, a lot of laws and practices were focused on keeping corporates in control of their vested interests.
They have powerful lobby groups and they can afford to push politicians and say, hey, we want to make more money, we want to stay on top, and we don't want to have to actually change our business model.
No, and what the EU is doing right now is revolutionary. With the GDPR, is they're providing the lawful context for an individual to exercise the same rights over their personality and information sharing as was previously simply prohibited to large companies.
And sometimes they get slightly interesting, like the geolocation lock, where you can now watch your Netflix in Belgium and you'll still see your Croatian Netflix, but not the Belgian one. Okay, so they're trying, but they need some help.
So let's look ahead a little bit. We've been looking back in time enough, I think. Let's go into scenarios. And quick disclaimer, the scenarios that we're going to look at are simply the result of our discussions and don't necessarily represent any form of tangible truth or even the presumption of truth. Please feel free to form your own scenario and think about it yourself, because that's what this whole talk is about, is to activate you into a certain way of thinking. So, the network of networks, we've briefly touched the topic. If you look at the idealistic approach of a globalized world would be a coherent network by itself. Well, that's not going to happen. We are going into a phase where you see continental networks approach, and these continental networks, they're either coming from a cultural background or a political background or an economic stability background, or not only economic stability.
Ideology. There's lots of reasons for you to clump into groups, and there's overlap between these groups.
And the interesting thing, and all right, I said let's not go in the past, but just entertain me for 1 second here. If you look at the situation that was in the era of the East India Trading Company, the world was basically cut in half. So the East India part of the world was basically given to the Dutch, and the other half was given either to the Portuguese and the English, or whichever country decided to wage war against the other. But it was a very nice way of separating the world into something that looked as clear as possible. So, but what you also see is companies like the East India Trading Company, they become too big to fail. The annual turnover of the East India Company, for instance, represented the majority of the entire Dutch GDP for over 120 years. So when the business case of the East India Trade Company basically ceased to exist, the whole country of the Netherlands went into an entire recession, and that sucks.
We saw this in the 30s, of course, also.
Yeah. So if you go into situations where you rely upon platforms that are too big to fail, you only need to think about the situation about 5 years ago in the financial crisis, in which we had big systemic banks in Europe being so immensely necessary for the function of normal day-to-day operations, that the mess that was created by basically the whole...
derivatives.
Exactly. That had to be solved by tax money. So that doesn't work very well. And there you go with the internet was in its essence by idealists mostly seen as a equalizing factor. But it's not. It's an amplification factor. So if we look at models of self-regulation in the past...
This is the one example we could find where it worked. Journalism. And nowadays we've got fake news. So it worked for a couple of 100 years. It was very important. And now it's completely disintegrating.
And the interesting thing is there is a lot of similarities between the ethical framework of the journalism code of conduct and the open source and free software movement. It represents a certain level of intellectual exchange. It represents a certain level of, let's say, detachment from the vested interests. It also represents a certain level of common good. Yet, what we see now is also in journalism that with social media and microblogging taking over, I mean, a personal estimate of mine, but I think that 80 to 90% of the blog posts that I read about, let's say, cooking or culture or other stuff, they're not authentic experiences by the person itself. No, they're basically paid advertorials by the companies who simply want to promote their interests. And, well, myself, I'm also a little bit guilty of that. We actually organize a festival, classical music festival in the city where we live. We happily provide anyone who's interested to share that information with any bite-sized nugget of information that we want to have shared. We're not paying for it, though. Let's make that disclaimer.
We're doing that one for free.
Yeah, because we don't have money, but that's a different story. So, how to achieve and maintain platform dominance? Anyone remember IE6? Yes, unfortunately, so let's skip that. But there's a number of other examples, especially in the tech sector in recent years, where you basically see every large, coincidentally US-based enterprise being smacked for antitrust behavior. And when literally every example of large tech industry is being framed in such a manner, what does that say about the industry as a whole?
Well, what it says to a piece, or part of it, is I'll never understand that Google said, yeah, guys, I am putting my own products on the top of the search engine because, hey, it's my search engine. Oh, Instead, they said, no, we don't do that. And then you go, antitrust.
They proclaim to be neutral. Well, of course they're not. I mean, they're not public infrastructure. They should have said, of course our products are best because we made them. So here we come again with the GDPR. And now, after this, we'll go into two specific scenarios. We have a negative outcome, and we will end with the positive outcome because we want to have you walk away here with a warm and fluffy feeling that everything will be all right, of course, which it will.
In the end.
Eventually.
In the end.
The biggest problem that we have nowadays is that regarding our personal information, which means our personal history, we do not have an exit strategy. We have nowhere else to go. There basically is no alternative to either, let's say, Facebook or WhatsApp or whatnot. And why is that? Well, not because you can't leave yourself, it's because your whole social context simply requires you to be there.
It's like WhatsApp. People now know it's been bought by Facebook, and they could have left for Telegram and Signal, and some people did, but everyone's still using WhatsApp because all their social context lives there.
And if you want to go into something that is being labeled as trickle-down economics, but actually is probably not, is the fact that basically Google in the Netherlands is the de facto platform for online learning environments. So how would it be that Google's hiring process already knows which people they want to hire before they have actually graduated? I wonder.
Yeah, why is Apple so interested in giving cut-price iPads and Macs to schools all over the world?
I doubt if it's a strictly philanthropical approach. So, negative, again, we've invested so much in these companies, we've invested so much in these platforms, that every step we take makes it harder to leave them. Yet there's also the economic fallacy of sunken costs there. It is the fallacy because we've already spent so much money on a certain path that we must simply carry on in that route. And that's also a bit of social capital, because we have to re-establish the way we communicate. If I look at a party of students nowadays, I literally see the students in the room communicating between each other through WhatsApp instead of talking to each other. I find that interesting.
Not necessarily bad, but different.
Exactly, interesting. And interesting is not necessarily a euphemism for bad. But it can also be for the good.
Yay!
Yeah, woohoo! Who wants coffee?
Regulation can be used as a power for good.
And it has done so in a lot of industries in the past. And if you look at the framing that is being done by the big tech corporations at this point in time, it is almost strictly that regulation is bad because it offers limitations and whatnot. But remember that until, let's say, the 1920s, when we didn't have any regulations towards evidence-based research on, let's say, medicine, for instance, people would simply create garlic water and added a lot of alcohol, which would then help you for your influenza. Well, it didn't actually help you for your influenza, but it would make you die very happily. But yeah, and that's an area where regulation turns out for the better.
And you have to remember that regulation is very difficult, especially for people doing something that they're not qualified to understand. Shit in is shit out. Yeah. So they need the community to tell them what they need to be doing. Politicians are politicians. They're very good at getting people on board, but they're not very good at being IT experts.
And also you need a certain level of, let's say, equality between the factors that are making the regulations, the factor that is enforcing the regulation, and the area of business on which the regulation is applied. Because if you go into regulating an area like pharmaceuticals, you have enormous companies with annual turnovers that are bigger than the national GDP of most civilized countries. You need a bigger body to enforce regulation on top of their heads than the actual body is themselves. And that's the trouble that we have with Facebook and Instagram, for instance. Yet the EU, one of the biggest semi-democratic governmental bodies in the world, has just disrupted their business model profoundly.
Yeah, but I'm very curious to see how they're going to enforce things that are transnational. So yeah, if there is no Facebook within Europe at all anymore, how are they going to levy the fines? I don't think they're going to send an army of people to California, say, give me the money. So it's a tricky thing because it is transnational. So we need some more transnational cooperation there as well.
And what that also needs is awareness. And awareness comes from education, and education can only be successful if provided from a more or less neutral background. And that is another aspect of the GDPR that is, in my opinion, a bit underrated at this point in time. But it's not only the right to be forgotten, it's also the right for transparency. I have the right to demand explanation from any company that's handling my data about what are you doing with my data, who are you sharing it with, did you actually have a proper contract with that party in place, and if not, well, I as an individual can go to my National Privacy Authority, raise the red flag, and they will take the fight from me to the company.
Yeah, unfortunately, we're seeing a trend within governments to do things under the without transparency, like the TPP and the GATT talks. We get to kind of hear about It's done. Here it is. Sign it. Thank you. And it's good to see that the EU, at least, is trying to build transparency into their legislation.
Yeah, because actually the international party investing most in, let's say, semi-judiciary systems on, let's say, international dispute settlement is the United States. The United States, which has a history of providing laws by foundational processes, themselves in the international context are promoting a new judicial reality outside of the courtroom, or at least in a hidden courtroom. That's interesting. And you see the behavior and the trends in Europe going the other way. So that is really positive. Open data, open standards, open source, transparency in government, and whatnot. And you also see, for instance, have you followed the debate about the new Secretary General of the committee last week? It was this German fellow who, by some, well, I'm hesitant to use the word blitz, but suddenly this guy became from a normal civil servant to be the most powerful secretary in the EC. And what happened there? Well, the European Parliament literally smacked Juncker around quite heavily. And that was a very nice example of a public control body actually functioning in the way it's supposed to. It doesn't have the power that it should have, but still, it does work.
It makes me glad to be in the EEC and not in America.
I'm incredibly happy to live in the EU because it's nice to live in the EU, and not only because the rest of the world is not nice. It is a positive thing. It's so nice here, I actually don't want to leave. But yes, go again, capitals. Monopolies are by definition bad for the innovation climate. And monopolies are not only formed by the companies that produce the services and the products. Monopolies can also be formed by the investment vehicles that steer those companies' courses by influencing them through shareholder interests. If you look, for instance, at the oil companies, most of the traditional oil companies like Shell and whatnot, they've realized that they need to switch to other types of energy decades ago. Yet, why didn't they do that? At least, why didn't they do that on a scale that they've by now reached that transition point already? Well, basically, because their shareholders told them, nah, we don't care, go on.
Economic viability is a huge factor for these companies.
And then we have social capital, because diversity means opportunity for everyone. Diversity means more interaction. And diversity, by definition, means that it must be a diversity between more or less equal parties and more or less equally challengeable organizations. And that means also the reintroduction of a positive localism and a positive national, let's say, cultural focus, as opposed to, let's say, the one-size-fits-all. I mean, Facebook, for instance, is culturally agnostic. Who feels really at home locally on Facebook? I don't. I want a Dutch subdivision of a social network.
Yeah, and you're seeing that as well with marketplaces. Generally, marketplaces are pretty local. So you do have eBay, but you also have Marktplaats.nl for the Dutch, and I don't know what you guys have. You have the Craigslist for most Americans, but...
And those are incredibly successful because they're actually a marketplace between equals. And we believe that we're moving towards a happy ending.
Well, thank you very much. We hope you enjoyed this.
So, enjoy your lunch.